Boys, Volume 9, The Big Ride, written by Garth Ennis, art by Russ, Braun, and John McCrea with Keith Burns, and this is covering The Boys issue 48 to 59. So this volume is really long. This is the longest volume of The Boys. It has 12 issues in it. So to put that into context, Highland Laddie last volume only had 6 issues, and my video to that one came out to about 45 minutes. This one has 12 issues, and it's over an hour and a half. But we're covering a lot of ground in this volume. If you ever lose your place, you can check the description for timestamps and jump to a specific issue. But this volume is pretty good. It is basically the history and origin of Greg Mallory. And Greg Mallory is a very interesting character. It definitely reminds me a lot of when Garth Ennis writes Nick Fury, another character he loves writing, a grizzled war veteran. So there's lots of comparisons there. Also, Butcher is clearly Punisher, so definitely lots of comparisons. But yeah, Mallory's an interesting character. We're going to learn about his history in World War II, what led him to hate Von American, eventually join the CIA, and eventually form the Boys and lead to the current day. We're also going to get an explanation of the first time the Boys went at the 7 and how that led to the death of Lamplighter and the death of Mallory's granddaughters. So we know a little bit about that, but we're going to get the sort of full explanation there. And we're going to get an explanation of sort of all the holes in the Boys' history that we sort of have. And then we're going to get a pretty interesting Jack from Jupiter story and sort of see tensions rise between the Boys and the 7. So all in all, a pretty solid volume. So let's dive into the story in Volume 9, The Big Ride. Issue 48, Proper Preparation and Planning, Part 1 of 4. Note, the cover of this issue is a parody of the iconic cover of The Dark Knight Returns. So when this issue opens up, Butcher, Frenchie, Mother's Milk, and the female are having a team meeting. They are discussing what went wrong last time they went up against the 7, why they failed, and what they can do differently this time. Frenchie says the 7 have no training, which is partly where our advantage comes from, because we are good at fighting, but at a certain power level, that advantage disappears. They discuss how Homelander, Queen Maeve, and Black Noir are real threats, but the rest of them aren't really in the same league. They discuss Homelander being a psychotic, perhaps even bipolar, and Butcher tells Mother's Milk to look over the various security footage tapes they have of the Homelander and see if they are missing anything. Over at the 7 HQ, James Stillwell is there talking with Jess Bradley, who is being introduced to the Homelander. Black Noir is getting a flying lesson. Apparently, he doesn't know how to fly his Noir plane. And apparently Annie has extended her leave of absence and has not returned to the 7 yet. So Homelander is being really nice, accommodating, helpful, and charming to Stillwell and Jess Bradley, and they kind of suspect ulterior motives of the Homelander. Jess comments about how she can't get those photos of the Homelander out of her head. She's saying this to Stillwell later, and Stillwell says, "Are you absolutely certain that you want to work in superhero development? Because if not, this is the time to tell me." But Jess reconfirms her commitment to Stillwell, though. Now back over to the Boys, Butcher and Mother's Milk are talking. Butcher is trying to smooth things over between him and Mother's Milk, who is still a little bit hostile about how Butcher handled the whole Hughie situation. Mother's Milk lets go of his reservations for now, though. Mother's Milk then asks Butcher, "You said before we're having another go at the 7. Are we really doing that?" And then Butcher responds, "I don't see how we can't. Frenchie heard the Homelander talking about backing Vought, and we know what for. He's going to use the lads they have in the White House to replace Dakota Bob with Vic the Veep, and Soups are going to be in the military. He's planning a soup coup. Jesus Christ, bloody right we're having a go at the 7. No choice about it." And Mother's Milk says, Frenchie saw a major powwow going on above the Believe event. There were some serious numbers of Soups we're talking about there. And Butcher replies, "Yeah, but the 7 are the key. We nobble the big boys, the others will just fall apart." And then all of a sudden, Kessler, or Monkey, walks in. Now back over at the 7 HQ, Homelander, Stillwell, and Jess Bradley walk back into the airplane hangar, and Black Noir is going to attempt to fly a plane here. The aircraft instructor has been explaining stuff to Black Noir for the past 3 days, but he has no idea if Black Noir actually understood any of that info because Black Noir doesn't speak. So Black Noir, he attempts to take off. The engines fire up on the plane, and the plane appears to flip and crash right away, right in the hangar. He clearly doesn't know what he's doing, and Jess Bradley is all of a sudden covered in the blood and guts of the now dead aircraft instructor that died when Black Noir crashed this plane. Black Noir kicks his way out of the plane and walks away, and Homelander is annoyed by this whole situation. Jumping back over to the boys' HQ, so Kessler, with a smug, proud look on his face, is talking to Butcher and Mother's Milk, and he announces that Susan Raynor is stepping down from her CIA director job. She wants to run for a Senate seat for the Democrats in Massachusetts, and Kessler himself is going to be the new acting director of the CIA, potentially full-time director. Kessler doesn't like Butcher and all the ways Butcher has disrespected him in the past, so he tells Butcher that he has a problem with Butcher's accounting and expense claims with his work for the boys. Large sums of money regularly going out on the basis of a somewhat scant justification from your end. And with that in mind, I've drafted these claim forms for future operations. I'd also like to see backdated forms for all your activities. Kessler then leaves very satisfied, and Butcher is not happy that he is now inundated with tons of paperwork, and Butcher says to Mother's Milk, "I'm a broken man." So he's not happy about this at all. Back at the 7 HQ, Jess Bradley is still a little bit dazed about the plane incident with Black Noir, and she's trying to calm herself down. She just took a shower cleaning off all that blood that got on her, and she says to herself, "Be strong. He's strong," referring to James Stillwell. "So you're strong. Only way." Jess Bradley goes back outside to talk with Stillwell, and Stillwell is ordering a new plane and a new instructor to teach Black Noir how to fly, and Jess Bradley makes the argument that how is anyone supposed to explain piloting to Black Noir? And Stillwell rebuttals, Victory Comics is always pushing for Black Noir to fly the plane because in the comics, they write him flying the plane, and in real life, every time Black Noir flies into some sort of event on the back of the Deep's back, it's kind of weird, and Victory Comics have to field numerous questions about why he's not flying the plane, so we gotta teach him how to fly the plane. Also, there's merchandising and the superpower and defense angle here to think about. But Jess Bradley counterpoints though, well, I hope it yields results, but if it doesn't, it's a lot of expense to satisfy the neat and tidy minds of comic geeks. And all of this assumes that it can actually be done, that Black Noir can actually be taught to fly. Throwing money at the problem isn't like a magic spell. There are some things that simply cannot be made to work. Stillwell listens to this argument, and he's convinced by it actually. He says, "You know what? I agree completely. As a matter of fact, when we get back, cancel my request for both a new aircraft and a new pilot instructor." Issue 49, Proper Preparation and Planning, Part 2. Homelander is looking at his own reflection in the mirror, and he is showing signs of a mental breakdown. He is talking and arguing with himself in the mirror, and it's sort of like two sides to the Homelander here. There's the normal dickish Homelander, but then there is the really dark and evil and really intense side of Homelander. And these two Homelanders are kind of arguing with each other. So the main, regular kind of reserved Homelander, he says, "People are toys and they're here for my amusement, and there's not a thing more to them than that." And then the evil Homelander says back to him, "Why tell me?" And then other Homelander, "What?" And an evil Homelander, "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself of something." Meaning, well, I'm no expert, but would a demigod beyond mortality of man really feel the need to declare it to a mirror? I shot down an airliner. I sent 200 people to their doom. I dropped that family into the ocean like they were toys, yes, as you said. Then would you mind telling me what that look is for? Are you scared? I have a theory. I think you're trying to impress Daddy, referring to James Stillwell. You pout, you posture, sometimes you score a point or two, but never to make any difference. He just won't truly acknowledge you, will he? Unless he needs something from you, like with Vic at Herogasm, then you're an adult for 5 whole minutes. But on the whole, it's just one long cringe of a memory. He leaves, you realize what you should have said 5 minutes later, just like a kid with a parent. And yesterday you were being very accommodating with him, weren't you? And then regular Homelander is like, you really are reaching. A fool could see I was putting him at ease. I was playing the simplest of roles. And then evil Homelander responds, well, I think we both know it's one you excel at. You get 5-star reviews season after season, really inhabiting the part. It's the finest tradition of the method. Bravo! Homelander almost punches the mirror at his reflection. And then the evil side of Homelander says back, yes, go on. That's what a sane person would do, right? Punch it and break a mirror. And Frenchie and Female are all watching this on the surveillance footage, and they are really seeing how far Homelander has gone. So this scene is really all about Homelander wrestling with his evil ambition of being free of Vought and societal norms, and doing whatever he wants, versus the side of him that toes the party line and tries to act like a more normal, sane human. So evil Homelander continues, these things you are so proud of, how come you can remember doing them, but not the things you are doing in Butcher's photos? Also, what about Butcher's wife? You figured you did something, you're responsible for her death, but for the life of you, you can't work out how. You've been racking your brain about that one, haven't you? So, why does Homelander not remember his actions in the photograph that we saw 2 volumes ago, where we saw him doing all these horrible things to various people and covered in blood? And why doesn't he remember what happened with Butcher's wife? So these are mysteries that will all be revealed eventually, but it's important to remember that Homelander can't remember some things about his past. Evil Homelander continues, the pictures of you, once you instate this plan of yours, what are you going to do when Butcher shows them to the world? And then regular Homelander says, well, at that point, he'll be too late, won't he? I'll be the king of hell. Now jumping back over to the boys' HQ, Butcher and Mother's Milk are talking, and Butcher is pissed about Kessler being the new CIA director and all his stupid forms that he wants Butcher to fill out. And Butcher comes across some sort of a news article about a female Paralympic athlete who is being honored by the president in a White House visit. So Butcher thinks that maybe he will utilize this to somehow screw over Kessler, because Kessler has a fetish for female paraplegics, so Butcher decides to go to Washington, D.C. for a few days. Frenchie and the Female come in to tell Butcher what they saw on the tape with the Homelander, but Butcher chastises them for leaving their post of watching the live 7 feed. Mother's Milk explains who Jess Bradley is and that she is Vought Guy's new deputy. And Mother's Milk explains that Black Noir must have broke another plane, and a replacement plane and instructor were ordered and then canceled, which is kind of weird. And Mother's Milk asks, how does a dude that's been flying a plane for over 30 years need instruction anyhow? I guess the boys don't know that Black Noir is secretly a shitty flyer and doesn't know how to fly a plane. So anyway, Mother's Milk is in deep investigation mode. Now back at Vought HQ, Stillwell promotes Jess Bradley. She has a new office, and she will still be reporting into Stillwell, but she will now be running the day-to-day of what Stillwell usually does, managing various soups. Stillwell tells her to monitor Homelander and the other teams and blind the new Vought CEO Brewster with science. Don't tell him what's really going on. And if you really want to impress, you can try and solve the one conundrum no one's been able to solve yet, Butcher and the boys. And Stillwell says he has to head over to DC for now. Now we jump over to Butcher. He is on the train to DC and he is talking to his dog Terror, who is riding the train with him. And Butcher begins to reminisce about the boys' first time they had a direct open confrontation against the Seven. So we are finally going to get more details on this moment in time. Years ago, Butcher was talking with Greg Mallory, arguing it was time for them to make their move. They had the go-ahead from Susan Rayner, and the boys knew the true story of 9/11. It was confirmed by Queen Maeve herself. A Homelander at this point had the photos sent to him as sort of blackmail 3 years prior, so he's got to be a little bit paranoid. It's the perfect time to turn the screw. And Mallory argues back, I know you have every reason to despise the Homelander, but don't let that blind you to how dangerous he is. And we still don't know who sent the CIA those pictures in the first place. Don't forget. So another mystery. Initially, when we saw those gruesome photographs, we maybe thought Butcher got those photos from his own surveillance, but it turns out they were anonymously delivered to the CIA. And then the boys sent it to Homelander to sort of scare him. But who sent the photos to the CIA in the first place? We don't know at this point. So Butcher talks about 9/11 and how the planes were called back and all the people on the Brooklyn Bridge that got killed because of this. And he says to Mallory, don't you want to make someone answer for all that? And Mallory says, so how do you think we should go about it? So Butcher's plan back in the day when they were first going at the Seven was to get in touch with the Homelander. Tell him we know what happened with the planes on 9/11 and tell him we're the people who sent the photos and we think it's time to talk. Because up to this point, the boys were an unknown to the Seven. Although the Seven heard rumors of this group, but Butcher wanted to arrange a meeting with the Seven and let them get a good close look at them. Just so that they know there is someone watching and that this mob the other soups go on about are in fact real. We tell them someone is getting thrown to the wolves for 9/11 and we decide tomorrow or you decide today. So that's sort of Butcher's plan, and Mallory responds, and you think they will choose to give up the Homelander, that Vought and the Seven will choose to give up Homelander? And Butcher says, they will once they see those bleeding photos of him. And Butcher continues, so when we first meet the Seven, they're going to ask why they shouldn't just kill us all right then. And then we're going to say, ask Homelander. And Homelander's going to figure out that we're going to send the photos to the public if anything happens to the boys. And he'll shut his mouth on the spot. What Homelander won't know is that we will have already sent copies of the photos to Vought American. So after a meeting with the Seven, and we sort of tell them what we want, the Seven are going to go home and they're going to talk with Vought American, and Butcher theorizes that a mutual decision will be made to give the Homelander up. And by the time that decision is made, we'll be miles away. And when Homelander is decided to be given up, he will take the blame for the handling of 9/11, and Homelander will be given two options. Either go public that the Homelander messed up a solo effort to stop the planes on 9/11 from getting through because he's a well-intentioned dickhead who was out of his depth, or Vought American will be forced to admit that they have a full-on maniac who cuts babies in half when we decide to release those photos to the public. So Butcher thinks this is a good way to sort of manipulate the situation to their advantage and get what he wants. And Mallory asks, well, so what would come after that then? And Butcher continues, well, Vought will put him out to pasture. Maybe they'll kill him even. So Mallory hears this, and then he says, well, there's also the wild card that no one ever foresees, that this whole thing might not go entirely the way you are scripting right now. And Butcher says, when does it? Mallory ends up agreeing, though, and gives the okay for this plan. He's a little skeptical, but he's buying into Butcher's plan and he's willing to go for it. So that was the plan. They put it into action, and everything for now is sort of following the script. So the boys are meeting with the Seven and they've explained their demands, and now it's the time in the script for the Seven to go home and talk it over with Vought American. Except Lamplighter, he has a hot temper. And he says, who are these pricks? And why do they think they can treat us like this? And what did that mean, that shit about asking you, referring to the Homelander? I got my frickin' ribs caved in that day on 9/11. I nearly died up there trying to stop that goddamn plane. And by the way, here's an image of Lamplighter hitting the wing of the plane back in Volume 3. So this is how he got injured a bit during the 9/11 attacks. And Lamplighter continues, and you're telling me these nobodies, they get to use that to mess with us? And then Mallory says, "You should control this man." And then the Lamplighter replies, "What?" And Homelander, he puts his hand on Lamplighter's shoulder, signaling for him to drop it, and the 7 go and fly away. So what Butcher didn't foresee, though, in his plan, is that when it comes to Vought, or any corporation, all that counts is profit. They send their kids on planes built by the lowest bidder. They travel on the things themselves. Company jets or first class, they still go on them. Safety costs, money is God. So if you sent proof that the Homelander, your #1 earner, is crazy, you don't do anything until you have no choice at all. You hang on. You keep him earning. What's suicide to anyone else is good business to lads like them. So Butcher kind of underestimated Vought's sort of commitment to the Homelander. The second thing that Butcher didn't foresee when he was scripting this all out is the wild card, Lamplighter. Lamplighter, when the 7 are flying back after their meeting, he is angry and he says, "To hell with it." And he blinds the rest of the 7 with his lamp, and he takes off from the rest of the group, and they lose sight of them when their vision returns. And Jack from Jupiter says, "Oh man, let him go. He just needs to scream and be a bitch for a while. Forget him. The pain he's been in the last few months, who the hell knows how many meds he's on. He'll come back tomorrow and he'll eat all the shit you want him to. Now can we just please go home?" And then we all know what happens next because it was explained to us all the way back in Volume 3. A Lamplighter killed Mallory's granddaughters. Issue 50, Proper Preparation and Planning, Part 3 of 4. Mallory punches Butcher in the face, saying that they were 12 years old, he's referring to his granddaughters. They didn't even get to live, and that animal just slaughtered them. And all you can say to me now is how high the stakes are. And Mother's Milk explains what happened. That Lamplighter followed them yesterday after their meeting, and he followed Mallory. And Mallory's daughter was in town with her twins. They were staying at this hotel. Mallory took his daughter to dinner while the twins, the granddaughter, stayed in the hotel room, and Lamplighter came in and burned them alive, and Mallory saw him flying away. Mallory asked to speak with Butcher alone, but Butcher says confrontationally, "Let them stay," referring to the rest of the boys. "They deserve to know what is on their boss's mind, deserve to know if he's still fit for command." And Mallory replies, "What do you know about command? You were a buck private, you never held rank of any kind." And Butcher says, "I'm a general, mate, and you let yourself get followed, and now you know what it's like to lose someone. And now you lost someone you really care about, and don't give me any of that old bollocks about your battalion in the war. I've seen enough officers cry crocodile tears about the lads they use as cannon fodder." And Butcher, he is being very confrontational and unsympathetic with Mallory, and Mallory is not happy. Mother's Milk then interrupts, saying the Legend and Queen Maeve want to have a talk. So Butcher and Mallory meet the Legend and Queen Maeve and are sort of talking about the aftermath of this meeting, and now that Mallory's granddaughters have been killed. Now remember that Queen Maeve is Butcher and Mallory's person on the inside of the 7. So Maeve is explaining what's going on her side. That Vought sent someone, most likely James Stillwell, in to have a talk with the 7 and get all the facts. This is the first time Queen Maeve has ever met Stillwell. He was new to them then. She explains that he was cool and calm, and he said everything was going to be all right. She describes the way Stillwell talks was like a bus conductor announcing the final solution during World War II. So Maeve explains that no one knew what Lamplighter was planning, and she thinks Vought want to make that up to Mallory, and they want to avoid confrontation and set up some sort of status quo between them and the boys. Queen Maeve recommends accepting whatever deal is proposed, or everyone on the planet is screwed. And Butcher says, "All that sounds like to me is you want to go back to your nice quiet lap of luxury." And Maeve explains her own personal hell, that she's an alcoholic, and on 9/11, when she was on that plane, and all the passengers realized that they weren't getting out, they tried to keep Maeve on the plane and take her down with them. But Maeve had to fly through the crowd on the plane, and when she got to the airplane door, they were all over her like paste. And now she drinks all the time, and she's going to have to drink even more. She says, I hate this shit. I want to just live inside myself. So 9/11 and her experience through that really sort of ruined her and really took her to a dark place. So the boys are going to have their big meeting with the Seven. This was sort of alluded to in previous volumes, but now we're getting the background story of it. The boys have arrived at some sort of old Air Force base, and somewhere there's snow. Frenchie says that this is like in the movie The Thing. This is what it reminds him of. Now the boys are wondering where Delta Squad is. It was this special forces platoon that the CIA sent on ahead of the boys, and they should be here by now. The Special Forces team was sent on ahead in case Vought had their Red River team there, so it was sort of for added protection for the boys. But the boys can't find Delta Squad, and they were walking around and they head into this hangar and the lights are off. And Frenchie says, I believe we are standing in them. And the lights switch on, and the room is covered in the Delta Squad soldiers' blood. It's just everywhere. And the Seven are there waiting. And Homelander says, what do you say we get down to business? And Mallory asks, you did this? And Homelander explains that Red River used nerve gas first, and after that, I single-handedly destroyed them all. Homelander kind of just did this to emphasize his argument of what he is proposing and what he is capable of. Homelander explains the deal. He says, you know the truth about 9/11 and you have other material, but you should understand that all will only take you so far. Never mind the certainty of your own deaths. Look at what you are standing in and then extrapolate. That said, an irreversible degree of turmoil profits no one. What we're suggesting is a mutual retreat from the brink. Vought American are prepared to suspend their program of superpower and national defense on a temporary basis. They acknowledge that the concept needs further thought. Also, Colonel Mallory, you suffered a personal tragedy. In the aircraft behind you is an item of compensation. And then we see Lamplighter tied up and given as a sacrifice to Mallory. Homelander says, and when you kill him, do it somewhere where his body won't wash up. Now, Butcher is staring down Homelander, remembering his dead wife. He is so angry that Homelander is not getting killed today, and his plan didn't pan out how he liked. Because Butcher has been dreaming of this moment of killing the Homelander for like the last decade and then some. And finally, he's face to face with the Homelander, and he's not able, and he's not given the go-ahead to kill Homelander right now. So the boys take off from their meeting on an airplane, and Mallory is seen pointing a gun to Lamplighter's head, and we assume he eventually shoots and kills him. Later on, when the boys arrive back home, Mallory tells Butcher that their team's funding has been pulled. The president is concerned that things went too far. Butcher asks, and how hard did you fight this? Implying that Mallory gave up too easy, because maybe Butcher is right, maybe Mallory did. And Mallory says, I'm done. Butcher is upset, and Mallory explains, I shot a man, referring to Lamplighter, and it felt pointless, as it always did. I tried to make it into something about justice, but I've been walking down this road since 1944. It all mounts up. It's 100,000 things. And Butcher says, Dakota Bob is out of his mind if he thinks the bastards will stop here. And Mallory says, well, maybe one day he'll realize he has to fight, and then maybe you'll get the call, but I'm done. And Butcher says, I've been with you for 15 years. For 15 years you told me I'd get to kill the Homelander, and he was in my sights, not 2 feet away. And Mallory says, he would have killed you. And Butcher says, there's a part of me that wouldn't have even cared just to spend 1 second with my hands around his neck instead of making frickin' deals. I was never even gonna get the chance to kill him, was I? You knew they'd never have the bollocks for it to really take on Vought. What's a dickhead like me next to the greatest soup that ever lived, the most expensive asset of the biggest corporation in the world? You knew what I'd lost, but you still made promises to me that you knew would never happen. All you wanted was a pit bull, wasn't it? F off, or I will bury you next to them 2 little girls of yours. And Mallory is surprised and a little hurt by Butcher's accusations and attitude. He then says to Butcher, You said you wouldn't have cared if he'd kill you, but what about us? Would you have cared if he killed us? So this sort of establishes us the difference between Greg Mallory and Butcher. Both of them want to succeed on their goals of taking down the Seven, but Greg Mallory doesn't want to do anything that would compromise his men, his soldiers, and perhaps lead to their death. Where Butcher is so focused on revenge and in a way kind of selfish, and he'd be willing to do whatever if it meant he could succeed and get his revenge. Now back to the present day. Butcher has arrived in Washington, D.C., and he hops in a cab and he heads to the Watergate Hotel. Issue 51, Proper Preparation and Planning, Part 4. This issue opens in the White House. It is some sort of party. The president is there. Nikki Brand, who is that Paralympic athlete / gold medalist who is being honored by the president, she is there. Stillwell and Vic the Veep are there. Kessler and Butcher are also there. Kessler comes across this Nikki Brand in her hotel room later, and he says how he has always admired her from afar, and it is destiny that they get together. He wheels her into her room and decides to try to sexually assault her, and he says, "I want to make love to your little broken body. I want to lick the pus from your bed sores." And Nikki is not into this, obviously, and she says, "What kind of crazy person are you?" And Kessler says, "There was a man who kicked me in my junk, so it doesn't work anymore. That's how I know your pain. We'll have to use this." And he pulls out a dildo. And Nikki beats the shit out of Kessler, though. After all, she is an Olympic athlete. And then Butcher comes into the room and he flashes his ID and he pretends to be Secret Service and he says, "I heard raised voices. What seems to be the trouble here?" So apparently, we're led to believe that Butcher knew that Kessler would try to sexually assault this woman, and he planned to be in Washington, D.C. to sort of stop Kessler and sort of use it to his advantage. I don't know if I'm buying all that, but anyway, that's what's happening here. Now, jumping back over to Vought HQ, Jess Bradley is researching into the boys' history and talking with Stillwell on the phone, and she says, "Why don't we use the boys and the Seven on each other? You said once the next stage is achieved, we can do away with the colorful costume stuff, so we won't even need the Seven then." And Stillwell says, "Well, that is still a way off." But Jess Bradley says, "Hear me out." And Jess Bradley got some computer nerds at Vought to write a simulation of who would win in a fight between the Seven and the boys. Points are awarded for each combatant's personnel strength, as well as intelligence and resourcefulness. And this simulation will tell us the probable outcome of the confrontation we're actually likely to see. Stillwell is skeptical, but he tells her to run the simulation if she wants, and she decides to do so. So she's going to run the simulation, see what the results are, and maybe formulate a plan. Jumping back over to Butcher, he has Kessler tied up to the bed in the hotel room, and Butcher sent Nikki down to the bar. He concocted some made-up story to Nikki about Kessler that made her not want to press charges, and now Butcher tells Kessler that, "I have you by the balls here, you're gonna do what I want." So he tells Kessler to cut this paperwork bullshit and expenses and any of that stuff out, and Kessler agrees. And then, to add insult to humiliation, Butcher tells his dog Terror, who's there, and tells Terror to have sex with Kessler, just like the dog banged the Shih Tzu back in Volume 1. So the dog bangs Kessler. Butcher later on goes to visit Susan Rayner. Now, when he goes to visit Susan, Susan is on edge, and she pulls out a gun because the last time Butcher was with her, Butcher said he would kill her children if she stepped out of line again. And Butcher says there's trouble coming. Vought have Red River people in Dakota Bob's security detail. Homelander's been talking to people, stirring the shit, making moves. Maybe it's time you and Bob faced facts. Susan says she doesn't care. She'll be gone in less than a month. And Butcher says, "Yeah, well, so will half the eastern seaboard if we have to stop them all the hard way." And Susan doesn't believe it. And Butcher says, "Imagine every soup coming at you at once in a coordinated attack. How far will the ammo you got get you then?" Butcher then gives her some secret files he acquired somehow. He doesn't tell her how he got these files, but Butcher explains that in Jonah Vogelbaum's notes, he learned that Compound V boosts brain chemistry, and that's what gives soups control over their abilities. And it comes down to increasing the strength of the neurons, and it turns out that these neurons give off a signal when they fire, to the point that they can be detected and homed in on by a radar-guided missile. If you adapt it properly, you could pass this info on to the Air Force, and they could add the weapon to their fighter jets to home in on these soups. And when these soups attack, you will be ready. And Butcher says he needs her. Wherever she ends up, even if she's not director of the CIA, she's never going to be far from the driving seat of the decision makers. And Butcher continues, Monkey, or Kessler, he's useless. But Raynor, she still can't get past Butcher threatening the life of her kids. And Butcher says to this, come on, I was royally messed up, but I ain't gonna kill anyone's kids. That's your game, remember? And Raynor then calms down a bit. And then the two share drinks, and Raynor explains Butcher's statement about her killing kids. And Raynor says all about how she used to be a field officer in the Middle East back in the day, and then later she was in charge of the missile strikes, some of which happened to kill children. And she explains how herself and others rationalize it all away. After they talk a bit more, Butcher goes to leave, but Susan, in a moment of weakness and attraction, asks Butcher, do you have to go right this moment, So Butcher stays a little longer. I guess Susan Raynor still has a thing for Butcher, right? And we see Butcher was secretly recording this conversation, perhaps in case he needs to use it as leverage on her later. Now jumping back over to Jess Bradley, her simulation is now complete, and the simulation shows that all the boys are killed, and Homelander Black Noir should survive this battle, and Queen Maeve is a maybe, but the rest of the 7 will probably be wiped out, and the simulation accuracy is supposedly 82%. So it's not too bad of results, so maybe Jess Bradley will put some sort of plan into action. Issue 52, Barbary Coast, Part 1 of 4. This issue opens up with Hughie talking with Greg Mallory and sort of discussing the fallout of Hughie's trip to Scotland and how Mallory was pretending to be that old Englishman there. So Mallory explains that what went down in Scotland is that he set up the drug deal thing, but he did not get Hughie's friend Det involved, and he did not want to lead Big Bobby into the middle of it all. Mallory set it up to see how Hughie would cope. And Mallory was there himself because Mother's Milk called him, and he says, no, I'm not a sweet old English gentleman. And Hughie says, so you wanted to see how I'd cope? Well, how did I cope? And Mallory says, well, the smuggling operation is done with, the Russian drug vessel was intercepted by the Royal Navy, so all the principals are in custody. On the other hand, you blundered into the middle of it, gave yourself away, you didn't have a plan, and you had one man badly injured, and you lost your temper and went straight at your opponent, and if it hadn't been for that bird spitting in that guy's mouth, he could have shot you dead. All in all, I'd give you a C-. And with that ID you carry, you should have snapped that guy's neck and walked away scot-free, but you've got no instinct for it. Work on that. And Hughie says he doesn't want to get better at killing folk. But Mallory says, well, you should at least try and get better at something. How long were you seeing that girl before you realized who she was? And Hughie says, you knew? And he's like, of course I knew. I recognized her right away. I keep up with this stuff, even if I'm not involved anymore. And Mallory then says, laying a soup and not even knowing? I played the nice guy, so you talk. And I listened to you bitch about your family in Scotland, but all I could see was people who love you. You have nothing to complain that I can see, and no excuses for not pulling your head out of your ass, which I have to say is going to take some doing. Yes! Thank you, Greg Mallory. I loved him giving shit to Hughie here. After listening to Hughie being a whiny bitch last volume, I loved him putting Hughie in his place. So Hughie says, no, the girl, it's not as simple as that. There are things I didn't know about her I wasn't ready for. And Mallory replies, put up or shut up. So where is she anyway? And Hughie says he's trying to keep her out of this for now. And then we have a flashback, Hughie and Annie, and they are in San Francisco, which Mallory lives somewhere near San Francisco, so that's why they're here. And Hughie says he has to go visit a guy. So this is a little bit before he visits Mallory. And he doesn't want Annie to come with him for this meeting. But Annie's still upset with Hughie because he's keeping stuff from her, and obviously he's not who he says he is. And he's not ready to come clean with her at this moment. Annie lists some of her other complaints, and Hughie says, "Do you think maybe you'd be better off with someone else?" And then Annie replies, "I feel like you're the only human being I've ever known. I mean, look at my foster parents, the young Americans, the 7. Look at how they all treated me compared to what you and I had. Why would I ever want to let go of you?" So Annie is willing to let Hughie work out his shit, see this mystery guy, and still give their relationship a chance, but she does need Hughie to explain himself. Jumping back over to Hughie and Mallory, Mallory reveals to Hughie that he is 91 years old, and Mallory also has Compound V in his body. And he explains what it's like living with Compound V as long as he has. He says, "You'll get a few more years than you might have done, and you won't look your age until the end. You'll only feel it." Pickled was the word Vogelbaum used to describe it. And Hughie asks, "So why are you interested in me in the first place?" And Mallory replies, "Because I wanted to know why you were chosen in the first place, and I'm still none the wiser. You should be aware that I walked away from the boys for specific reasons, and getting involved with them again is not a thing I do lightly. I came back because I'm afraid of what might be happening." And then Mallory is then going to explain his origin. It was the last winter of World War II. Mallory was part of a tank division. He was a captain then, an executive officer to the battalion. He loved it. He more so enjoyed it because he cared about his fellow soldiers, less so having anything to do with the actual army. So Mallory gets called into a meeting with his colonel, and Mallory explains that the colonel was a lion in combat, but a pussy in all other circumstances. He would lead soldiers to battle like a beast, but when some general happened along with some stupid suicidal attack plan, he wouldn't fight for his men's lives. He'd fight the enemy, he just wouldn't fight for us. Now the colonel introduces Mallory to Senator Prescott Sheldon Bush, who is the real-life father to George H.W. Bush, as well as to Henry K. Newman, who was the president of Von American at the time, and is perhaps the grandfather to Vic the Veep. Now, they announced to Mallory that they want to use his platoon to test out various super soldiers in combat trials. Now, Mallory is skeptical about the whole thing, and they lead Mallory to a back tent where 7 soldiers are there to greet him. And we see here, these are the members of the World War II Avenging Squad, which is a parody of the Marvel hero team, The Invaders. So we have the original Crimson Countess, the original Soldier Boy, we have Steel Knight, who is a World War II version of Tech Knight, we have Ladio, who is a World War II sidekick of Steel Knight, we have Eagle the Archer, Manbot, and the Buzzer. Now Mallory says, "Is this a joke?" Now at this point in the war in World War II, it was kind of quiet, and at the time and place where Mallory was stationed, there wasn't too much going on, but the problem was, the war was about to heat up. The Battle of the Bulge was on its way, and the Battle of the Bulge was the last major Nazi-German offensive campaign on the Western Front during World War II, so shit was about to hit the fan. Issue 53, Barbary Coast, Part 2 of 4. Mallory can't believe his orders that he has to allow these costumed people into his battalion and that they will be going into combat with them. But the orders are from Eisenhower himself. So Mallory says hello to the soups, and the original Soldier Boy salutes, saying, "Soldier Boy in the Avenging Squad reporting for duty." Now the Von American guy says, "The Avenging Squad name isn't final. It would either be Revenge or Justice. We're still testing out some themes." He explains, "But you're looking at 5 years of work of our research department's most brilliant minds. Human beings adapted by science to be stronger, smarter, and faster than any other soldier on the battlefield." So it's time for a display of the hero's abilities. Soldier Boy and Steel Knight are attempting to lift a tank. Ladio is cheering Steel Knight on from the sidelines. Now they manage to lift the tank about a foot off the ground, struggling pretty hard it looks like, but lifting the tank a foot off the ground is kind of impressive. But as Mallory points out, some German tanks weigh double what this tank weighs, and they'll be shooting. Now Mallory is told it doesn't matter because Crimson Countess can melt tanks. And Crimson Countess gets ready to sort of demonstrate her abilities, but Mallory says, well, maybe not on one of our tanks, okay? So Mallory doesn't like that these people, these soups, haven't been battle tested, and if we're going to be depending on them for our lives, he would like for them to be prepared. And right now, Mallory says his squad is understrengthed and they are in no shape to face German tanks. But Bush says, well, that's why the squad is here, so they can train with you. Isn't this a quiet part of the line anyway? And Mallory says, well, it's still the line, and we're still in Germany. No one who hasn't seen combat has any business being here at all. And Soldier Boy interrupts and says, there's no need to worry about the German tanks. There's nothing like that in this area. We've already checked it out. And Mallory says, what do you mean you checked it out? And the Soldier Boy says, well, I sent Manbot Buzzer and Eagle the Archer to fly up and take a look. And then all of a sudden, people are kind of worried. They're saying, on whose authority did you order this reconnaissance mission? If the Germans see a flying man, they might get a little suspicious and send scouts in their last noted direction who potentially might find us not equipped to defend ourselves. So Mallory is all of a sudden really worrying, and he's losing his shit. Sure, they haven't seen the Germans in weeks, but better safe than sorry. So Mallory starts sprinting and telling his men to mount up, start up the tanks, and get ready. And sure enough, Mallory's suspicions were correct. The Germans did find them and did follow Eagle the Archer, Buzzer, and Manbot, and the Germans are now ambushing them. The Germans open fire from the trees, and within seconds, various members of the Avenging Squad are wiped out. Eagle the Archer, though, he starts flying. He tries to get high above the action, but he flies up into the path of an allied plane, causing it to crash into him, killing him as well as destroying the plane. So the German tanks are now rolling in, and Mallory and his men are trying to get their tanks going and try to fight back, but the Germans are eviscerating them. Mallory ended up being the only survivor that day. He eventually came across Soldier Boy, missing nearly half his body and saying, "Help me." And Mallory finishes him off, putting him out of his misery. Mallory was eventually captured by some Germans and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. And when the Germans apparently found him on the battlefield that day, though, he was sitting in the snow and staring at a piece of bloody leather, and it must have come from someone's costume, and it had the words "Vought American" consolidated, brand name stamped on it. It was a fragment of the day he took away with him. And from that day on, Mallory disliked Vought American for pushing their stupid heroes onto him and accidentally leading the Germans to his men's location and causing the death of everyone. Issue 54 of Barbary Coast, Part 3 of 4. Mallory says he got back from the POW camp after the war in 1945, but he was feeling like there was unfinished business, some sort of battle he should fling himself into, but there was no more war at this time. So eventually one of Mallory's friends, a guy named Rick Burnham, points him toward joining something that would eventually become the CIA. Mallory at some point told his story about Vought and all these superpowered people in the war, and he told it to this group of CIA people, but no one paid much attention to it. Mallory looked into Vought American on his own, but he concluded that it appeared they scrapped their superhero project, and Mallory was happy to forget about it for the moment and focus on what everyone else was focused on, the Cold War and Russia. So that went on for a few years for Mallory, just focusing on Russia and spying and all that. But eventually in the 1950s, on the cover of the Washington Post, Vought brought the Avenging Squad back. Same members, except this time with different people under the masks. And eventually this team, we know, would go on to become Payback. So Mallory phones his friends in the CIA and he tells them, "This superhero stuff, this is what I was telling you all about during the war, what I saw." But everyone at the CIA, they didn't really care. the Korean War was just starting and everyone was focused on that now, and Mallory was being dragged into that. So Mallory went and focused on the Korean War and continuing the whole Cold War stuff that was going on. But he always kept an eye on Vought, though. Another thing to note, timeline-wise, is that in the 50s, when Vought introduced their new and very first public superhero team to the world, this Avenging Squad or Payback, but secretly at this exact same time, this is when the Homelander was born and Jonah Vogelbaum was growing him in a lab. So Payback was sort of a way to blaze the trail and lay the groundwork eventually for Homelander and to tell the world about him. So now it's the 1960s and the Vietnam War is on, and Mallory and his friend Rick, both CIA, they fly over to go check out what's going on over there. And Mallory sees the US soldiers with their heads cut off and mounted on their shitty guns. And this is what the legend mentioned back in Volume 3 when he was sort of telling us the history of the United States. So Mallory is disgusted by this, and he's pissed at Vought for making such shitty weapons. He says, "The magazines are practically made from aluminum foil. I doubt you could get off 5 rounds without the feed buckling. I can't believe we sent men into combat with this piece of garbage. Vought have got to be made to pay for this. Heads are going to roll." Mallory was watching the memorial service for some of those Vietnam servicemen on TV. And someone who was watching with Mallory pointed out the legend on the TV to Mallory and said, "Oh, that's a funny little man who runs Victory Comics. My boys love him." So Mallory doesn't know who the legend is at this point, but he knows what Victory Comics is and the relationship to Vought, and he finds it interesting that the legend would be here. So he investigates into the legend, and he finds out that the legend's son was killed in Vietnam and all that. And, he figures that the legend probably isn't happy about that. Now, when Mallory's telling this part of the story to Hughie, Mallory nonchalantly says, "The first son, not that bastard whelp he produced with Queen Maeve." Anyhow, so he kind of brushes past that, but it's kind of a big thing to know. So in case you don't know what that means, is that Blarneycock, who was the legend's son, it's now confirmed that the mom was Queen Maeve. So the legend and Maeve hooked up and had a bastard son. So anyway, Mallory continues his story, and he eventually reached out to the legend, and the legend tells Mallory everything. The entire history of Vought, the truth about the Homelander's origins, the support Vought have in Congress, the support their opposition have, Jonah Vogelbaum and Compound V, everything. So Mallory decides it's finally time to focus his attention on Vought, and he decided to start with Jonah Vogelbaum and Compound V. And Hughie says, "But Vogelbaum killed himself." And then Mallory says, "No, he didn't. The legend thinks that, along with Mother's Milk and the rest. But Vogelbaum didn't kill himself." So the CIA at this time, they didn't care about Vought, so Mallory was on his own. So therefore, he had to turn Supes and their owners into an actual visible threat. He also had to be able to neutralize it, or at least combat that threat. So in pursuing these objectives, he was finally able to utilize the skills and resources of the CIA to do something worthwhile. He learned Vogelbaum's location from the legend, and he anonymously sent the details to the CEOs of Boeing, Dow, General Dynamics, and several other Vought American competitors, and he waited for them to act. And then he followed the abductors and eliminated them. Now, Mallory was going to kill Vogelbaum too, but he didn't have it in him to kill a whimpering little 70-year-old man. Vogelbaum was the classic scatterbrained academic, hiding in his work from the memory of his family's murder, hiding from the reality of where his work was headed. And Mallory figures killing Vogelbaum wouldn't have stopped Vought. They already had the 7, so Mallory decided that Vogelbaum should come to work for the US government, or at the very least, should at least come to work for him. So Hughie asks, "So why does everyone think Vogelbaum killed himself?" And Mallory said, "Well, there are certain freelancers, the CIA employees, that can provide cadavers or lookalikes, so we faked Vogelbaum's death and most of the world would think he was gone." So after that, Mallory went to his CIA friend and superior in the organization, who is pretty high up, that Rick Burnham, his friend of his I mentioned earlier, And Mallory explains the situation to him. Now Rick, he initially did not see Vought American as a threat, but now he was on Mallory's side. And Mallory was a little worried that Rick would want to use Vogelbaum and work on building soups for him instead, but Mallory believes that it doesn't matter who controls the purse strings. You can't put a human brain behind a power like that and expect any good to come of it. So Mallory really didn't want Vogelbaum to be creating more soups, but he did need something from Vogelbaum. So Mallory briefed Vogelbaum and explained that the disastrous potential of what he'd created, and Vogelbaum eventually decided to play ball. So Mallory wanted Vogelbaum to create a formula. It took him 7 or 8 years to make, and the formula was a one-shot injection of compound V that increased strength and endurance by a factor of 20. It did not make you fly, and it didn't make you bulletproof, but you could stand up to the soups. And you wouldn't exactly be able to be a superhuman that the US Army would consider using on the battlefield in a massive game-changing way, but you'd be able to stand up to the soups, and it was sort of enough to sort of combat these various powers that Vought American had. So when Mallory told Rick that this formula was created and this drug was done, Rick asked how much did it cost to make this? How much of the CIA's dark money budget was used on it? And when Mallory told him, Rick had a heart attack because it was so much money. But Rick recovered, and 2 years later he was director of the CIA. So eventually Mallory made his pitch to Rick about his plan. The CIA would never have an army of soups. They just couldn't afford it. It was too expensive. And they couldn't announce what they did have either, or Congress would lose their shit over how much money they spent creating this drug. But the CIA could have operatives to oppose the soups. And the way things were moving, they were going to need them. And by this time, it was around 1985, and Vought just added the G-Men to their roster and showed no signs of slowing down. So Mallory wanted to create a team to monitor Vought American superhero development. The tiny reserve of one-shot compound V doses they did have would be used to empower their operatives, but they needed a guinea pig to test it out on first. So Mallory volunteered, and he was the first to get injected with compound V, and then Mallory went looking for other candidates to join his team, and that's when he met Butcher. Issue 55, Barbary Coast, Part 4 of 4. So Mallory talks about Butcher. He says Butcher is good at keeping his mouth shut. He likes to know intel, secrets, people's confessions, all of it, but he divulges no more of his own business than he carefully chooses to. Mallory says what he knows of Butcher, that Butcher was born in London in 1965. He joined the Marines at the age of 16 and fought in the Falklands War a year later. He was wounded and court-martialed for the worst of a series of violent assaults, which began not long after his recovery. One of his brothers died in an accident at the age of 19. His mother died recently. His dad is still alive. Hughie asks, "Why did you want Butcher? I mean, what about him did you particularly like?" Mallory says, "Because I felt it. Superhumans had killed or ruined someone's life close to him. They'd smashed his life, as they had mine, as they had you. And I wanted people who had no choice but to be involved. I wanted people who lived, breathed, ate, and dreamed this thing." For the first few years, Mallory had to be content with 2 operatives and a fairly limited purview. But then Dakota Bob took a hand, and slowly things changed. Mallory then goes on to explain a little bit about Dakota Bob's history. Dakota Bob was the last-minute replacement as Bush's running mate for VP in 1988. Dakota Bob is tied in heavily with defense contractors, and he wanted Vought American's agenda to be torpedoed. So as soon as the CIA got wind of this, that Dakota Bob didn't like Vought and he was now vice president, Mallory and Butcher got in to meet Dakota Bob, and Dakota Bob would help smooth the way for the boys to do their work. And their work continued on in the 90s with Clinton in office, and then in 2001, and Dakota Bob was now president, and he got in touch again. So one would assume that Butcher and Dakota Bob are still in touch and have been this whole time, albeit discreetly. Mallory also says that Susan Rayner was Rick Burnham's deputy and eventually replaced him to become director. Now, Mallory never really liked Susan Rayner. He felt she was just using the CIA as a stepping stone to something else, whereas Rick was more of a company man. So that's sort of a little bit of history of the CIA and Susan Rayner. So Mallory eventually circles back to Butcher and he tells the origin of how they came up with the name for the team. Mallory was just going to call them Unit X, but Butcher said, though, nah, that's terrible. We'll sound like a bunch of wankers. Where I come from, when somebody wants someone done over, you talk about sending the boys around. Harry's turned into a right-mouthy twat. I'm going to send the boys around. So that was Butcher's explanation, and Mallory was like, whatever, and he went for it. So that's why they are called the boys, because of Butcher and his history with that word. So they gathered the others and they went to work. Mother's Milk was a great investigator, and Frenchie and the female were good for extreme situations. Over time, though, eventually, Mallory noticed a change in Butcher. Butcher slowly began to take control of the group, gradually increasing the level of violence the boys used against Supes, often manipulating events until lethal force was the only option. At first, they would just watch, police, and only very occasionally take final action. But then eventually confrontation became more and more common. Events seemed to conspire to give the targets little choice. The screw would be turned until the humiliation was unbearable. Where Mallory had preferred to warn and intimidate, both concepts were now rendered irrelevant. There was rarely anyone left standing. And subtly and gradually, the body count went up. Finally, one day in the 2000s, the boys went to one of Vought American's pageants, like what Annie explained she went through. And Frenchie, he doesn't like seeing cruelty to children, so he flipped out and Vought American panicked. And they hit this panic button and they left. And that panic button they pressed, in this case, meant sending out a hefty dose of sarin gas and killing all the kids. Now, Mallory said this was a massive overreaction. Killing all these kids with sarin gas, and the executive responsible for the decision got fired. But regardless, that wasn't the point. The point was how Butcher reacted to this. So the boys were now standing in a room full of dead kids. And Mallory did not like Butcher's attitude about the situation. Butcher says, sort of nonchalantly, "Saves us the trouble, I suppose." And then Mallory asks for an explanation. And Butcher says, "Well, in another 10 years, we'd be killing them ourselves, wouldn't we?" Then Mallory says, "Not necessarily. Not every single Supe is necessarily a target. Any that continue to indulge in the usual banal hedonism without causing anyone harm are no concern of ours. Unless, Vought American's plans are brought into effect, of course, but by the time that day comes, the intelligence we've collated will have enabled us to identify and neutralize most of the potential threats in advance." And Butcher says, "I'll tell you how to neutralize a potential threat. You killed a lot of them, every single asshole in tights." And Mallory says, "And how do you propose to commit this particular genocide?" And Butcher says, "Well, you can't, can you? I'm talking about in an ideal world." And Mallory says, "But you would if you could." And Butcher replies, "Bleeding right I would. No one should be allowed to walk around with what they've got. It's just too much of a risk. And as the old saying goes, with great power comes total certainty that you're going to turn into a cunt." Now later on, 9/11 happened. And the whole confrontation with the Seven and Lamplighter being killed, and Greg Mallory's granddaughters being killed, and the stalemate was agreed to between the boys and the Seven. And Butcher wasn't happy because Susan Rayner pulled the funding for the boys. And Mallory began to regret what he created. And he regrets not disbanding the boys himself and having Susan do it. And Mallory says to Hughie, "My crime was to give Butcher a war, a self-sustaining, never-ending conflict in which he can met out brutality and cruelty that lie at his core forever. He can't kill them all and he doesn't want to. All he wants is to go on, hurting the people that he believes hurt him. In the end, all his plans come down to exactly the same thing I'd seen in the CIA do time and time again, and Mallory was determined to avoid it. Mallory feels bad because he feels like he created a team, a special forces team, answerable to no one, justifying its existence through the creation of its own missions and agenda, impossible to stop, completely and totally out of control, just like the CIA always does. And Hughie sort of says, that's not what it is, that's not what the boys is. And then Mallory challenges Hughie, let's see you rein in the boys then, Hughie. And Hughie says, do you really think Butcher is that bad? And Mallory replies, I'm certain of it. Mallory says he had one loose end though. Vogabomb was still alive. Mallory never killed him. And Mallory, he didn't want Bot getting at Vogabomb or someone else forcing Vogabomb to make more soups. So Mallory felt that, well, we had our supply of Compound V that we could use. Vogabomb was a loose end that needed to be dealt with. Mallory still says he didn't have it in him to kill Vogabomb himself. So he sent Butcher in to do it, and Butcher seemed delighted to get his hands on the man who started it all. So Mallory drove Butcher to this house, and then Butcher went into the house, and then when he emerged where Vogabomb was, he then returns to Mallory waiting in his car, and Butcher spits a bloody gob of unidentifiable meat onto the ground. And the implication is that Butcher's hate is so intense that when he killed Vogabomb, he bit or possibly even ate a part of him. Now Hughie can't believe it. But Mallory says, there's no one on Earth who hates like that man. God help the Homelander if Butcher ever really has him at his mercy. Mallory continues, the boys against the Seven, and by extension the CIA against Vought American, that's going too far, which is why I washed my hands of the whole thing, and I came out here to the coast to live out the rest of my life here. So Hughie's heard it all, and Hughie's going to leave now. But before he heads out, he says to Mallory, I think your tough old bastard war veteran is as much an act as your kind-hearted English gentleman. I think you're a fake. I think the real thing's just one more arrogant Ivy League prick who thought he had the right to mess around with the world. I mean, you're out here kidding yourself. You're a man of honor or whatever, and your hands are clean. After all the bloody things you've done, the shit you let loose, it looks to me like we're talking about more than one monster. And Mallory says, I'd say that was about enough. And Hughie goes on, oh, what is it? You and me, right here. Are you still trying to pretend you're an American soldier, Colonel? Mallory kind of respects Hughie for sticking up to him a bit here. And Mallory replies, I guess there's hope for you yet, boy. And then Hughie says, will you sit out here on your coast, carrying on, looking the past in the eye and feeling clean? And then Hughie heads off. Hughie goes back to the motel he is staying at with Annie, and he tells her everything. He says that he's in the CIA, and how he got recruited, and how he killed Blarneycock, and all the stuff the boys does. And he says that he's sorry that he stood in judgment of Annie, and what Hughie was doing was maybe even more dishonest than what she was doing. But he warns her, don't go back to the Seven, as it's dangerous, and a whole bunch of shit is gonna go down soon. And Hughie says, no matter what's going on between us, I still love you. Now jumping back over to Mallory, someone has broken into his house. We don't know who it is for sure, but it's implied to be Butcher. And Mallory suspects that Butcher is here to kill him. Butcher asks, so what'd you tell him? And then Mallory says, everything. And then Butcher says, I wonder why Mother's Milk was given in so easy. Only way it made sense is if he'd handed things over to you. And then Mallory says, I really don't care. I'm 91 years old. It feels like twice that. My daughter never spoke to me again, and she's the only person I really care about. Even with all the things I got wrong, my life doesn't even qualify as a joke or a lie. It's nothing more than a lump of dog shit. So why don't you do me a favor and get it the hell over with? So he's waiting for Butcher to kill him. And that's the end of Greg Mallory. Issue 56, The Big Ride, Part 1 of 4. So Hughie, after being gone for almost a month, he went to Scotland, he met Greg Mallory, he learned all about more history of Butcher and the boys and the CIA and everything. Hughie's finally ready to go back to the boys. And as he's heading back, Butcher walks out and just says, bloody hell, look who it is. You coming? Fanfare and trumpets wait for no man. We've got a job. You coming or what? So Hughie goes along for the ride. Butcher is briefing Hughie in the car. They are investigating a murder of a transgender sex worker that may be linked to Jack from Jupiter of the Seven. Apparently there is this soup pimp guy that gets soups whatever they're after. Girls, boys, pills, porn, whatever. And apparently this guy hooks Jack up, as well as various other heroes. And apparently what Jack likes to do, he likes to say his magic word, turn invulnerable, and have a gang of them have sex with him. So Butcher and Hughie are going to go visit this pimp. So when Butcher and Hughie arrive, Butcher asks Hughie if he's still talking to Annie. And Hughie lies and says no, and Butcher's pleased by this. Now Hughie, he wants to establish some new ground rules with Butcher, and he says he doesn't want to be playing catch-up like he used to. He wants to be involved properly. Every time there's an operation, he wants to be involved in the decision-making process. And then Butcher says, "Blimey, Hughie, who have you been talking to?" And Hughie says, "Look, this is non-negotiable. There was a lot of stuff I didn't like before. There were too many surprises. And if I'm going to come back for good, I want to be all the way on in the inside now. I want to be second in command." And then Butcher says, "I could have done a better job filling you in before, but I got to play stuff close to the chest. I can't stop the show for a show of hands. I got to keep things moving. And what about Frenchie and Mother's Milk? They've both been here longer than you, and all of a sudden they're going to call you Sarge?" And Hughie argues back, "I'm not saying you got to consult me when the shit's hitting the fan, but I'm talking about before that, before we even decide what we're doing, when we're sort of planning. I'm sorry, my mind's made up and that's it." The Butcher doesn't like his authority being questioned. He says, "You went off for nearly a month and come back and drop this in my lap, and all you say is your mind is made up? That's it?" Hughie reconfirms his stance, saying, "Yes." Well, Butcher makes Hughie a deal. He says, "You gotta earn it. If he does good on this job, prove he can think on his feet, prove he has what it takes, Butcher will allow it. And they'll figure out what to tell Mother's Milk later." So they arrive, and Butcher then introduces Hughie to a guy named Dr. Peculiar. I assume the name is a light parody of Doctor Strange. So Dr. Peculiar, Doctor Strange. Anyway, we jump over to the Seven headquarters. And Jack from Jupiter appears to be in trouble for whatever he did, for potentially killing this transvestite. Jack from Jupiter is defending himself and saying he didn't do this shit. He didn't kill that transvestite or whatever, and the rest of them don't believe him. And Jack says, "I haven't seen Dr. Peculiar for months." And then A-Train says, "Come on, Jack, it's your thing. I mean, some of the porn you forwarded me, I mean, Jesus. No one is judging you or anything. It's just that if things went a little too far one time," then Jack takes offense and then he yells at A-Train, "Oh, you two-faced little bitch, A-Train. When I remember the shit I've done for you, the people you'd have never met without me, I trusted you and you sit here and do me like this? With this passive-aggressive crap? You think anyone here actually buys it? Or you think you're gonna get ahead? You couldn't be less subtle." And then Jack says to Homelander, "I don't think it would be a good idea for any of us to stand in judgment of anyone else's extracurricular activities. There are very few secrets left around here either about where people stick it or where they like it stuck. Regarding what I do at Dr. Peculiar's, topic closed. But regarding Vought's email, I did not kill that free." Homelander still doesn't seem convinced. And then Jack yells, "Dude, you can put me on a lie detector." And then the Deep says, "You realize this is the worst possible time with what Homelander's plan coming to fruition soon?" And then Homelander says, "Hey, I don't want any discussion of my plans here. Vought took the bugs out, but they could have easily have been replaced. We never figured out how Butcher's people got the bugs in the first place. So we gotta be careful what we say around here." And then Maeve, who is staying out of it, is just drinking, listening to their conversation, but she's a little bit worried about those bugs that she replanted for the boys. So Jack and A-Train argue some more, and then Homelander just tells Jack to keep a low profile for now, and hopefully the police investigation will lead elsewhere. We jump back over to Dr. Peculiar's, and Butcher says he is going to have a look around. And then we see Dr. Peculiar has these weird green monkeys jumping around. So Butcher and Hughie, they go into this next room where apparently Dr. Peculiar keeps a photographic record of the various sex acts various superheroes partake in. Each hero having their own book or file with a whole bunch of stuff on them. Whether it be Soldier Boy drinking piss or doing something called the human ashtray, it's all collected here. Butcher says the doc keeps this not for blackmail or anything, but to make sure the soups don't damage the merchandise, so to speak. Butcher grabs the Jack from Jupiter file and starts looking through it, and then Hughie sees a book on Queen Maeve, and he starts reading through that, just out of curiosity. Now apparently, Dr. Peculiar performs abortions for the soups when they need it, and Queen Maeve has apparently had over 24, and one of them being Stormfront's. So at one point, Stormfront got Queen Maeve pregnant and she got an abortion. Now Butcher, he reads the file on Jack from Jupiter, and on the night of the murder, Jack from Jupiter was in fact here. But the tranny that died was not one of the ones he was with. He paid for 4, but he ended up dismissing one of them, saying he was feeling old and he only wanted 3. Apparently, Jack was here till about 1 in the morning. Now while Hughie is listening to this, he slips Queen Maeve's file into his back pants and he wants to read it more later. Now Butcher, he doesn't believe that Jack killed this guy though. Jack doesn't like doing rough stuff to other people. Plus, Jack is really weak. When he says his word, he's pretty invulnerable, but without saying his word, I doubt he'd win in a fight with Stephen Hawking, Butcher says. Well, Butcher says it's time to leave. He's done looking at the file. And as they're heading out of Dr. Peculiar's, Hughie sees a weird statue, and then Butcher says, "Oh, bloody hell, Dr. Peculiar had a statue made out of it?" And the statue is of Kessler, and 2 monkeys are on his head, and they're having sex with his ears. Apparently, when Susan Rayner became the CIA director, she wanted an official observer along for all the boys' jobs, so Kessler was sent. And on one of the jobs with the boys, they went over to Dr. Peculiar's, and for whatever reason, the green monkeys went mental when they saw Kessler, and they just jumped on his head and started having sex with his ears. And Butcher was laughing hysterically. He said, "It was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life." Butcher eventually pulled the monkeys off Kessler, but the damage was done. And this is how Kessler got the nickname Monkey. Issue 57, The Big Ride, Part 2 of 4. Hughie and Annie are sleeping in the same room at Hughie's apartment back in New York, but Annie is on the bed and Hughie is on the floor, so there are still some issues between the two. And they start talking about Hughie being in the CIA and what they are doing, and Hughie doesn't want Annie involved with the boys. She doesn't want Annie to go undercover or something. It's all too dangerous. And then Annie says, "Why don't the 2 of us just run away?" And then Hughie says, "I've thought about it, but I feel committed to this. I'm stuck in it too far deep to just piss off. I have to stick around to keep an eye on things." Hughie also talks about Butcher and how Hughie feels frustrated. He wanted to come back to the boys all decisive and tell Butcher how it's going to be from now on, but Butcher kind of instantly overturned it and sort of brushed it aside and sort of manipulated Hughie. So Butcher is back at the boys' HQ, and all of a sudden, his secret video feed of the 7 goes dark. He thinks maybe that it's on the fritz or something, or maybe Maeve killed it because a sweep was coming in, or maybe they got to her. Now we see Queen Maeve at the 7 HQ and she's tossing all the bugs off their base. She was probably nervous because of all the talk of the bugs earlier from the other members of the 7, so security footage feed has gone down. I'm back over to Annie and Hughie. Annie asks Hughie, "Why don't you just ask your boss and confront him about your worries about him?" And then Hughie says, "Because I'm scared to, in case all these suspicions I got turn out to be true." And then Annie and Hughie talk about some of their history of the bugs in the 7 HQ and what that was like from her perspective, what she heard Homelander and James Stillwell talking about. Annie then asks Hughie to join her on the bed, just to sleep, so Annie's sort of wanting to make things a little bit better between her and Hughie. In the morning, Hughie returns to the boys' HQ. Frenchie gives him a warm welcome, and the female presents Hughie's hamster, Jamie, back to him. The hamster is super fat now. And Mother's Milk gives Hughie a beer, and then Butcher says him and Hughie can probably handle the whole Jack from Jupiter thing themselves. Butcher thinks it's all a little too convenient, though, and it don't fit Jack's sort of profile. And Hughie asks, "So if it did turn out to be Jack, what would be our first move?" And then Butcher says, Well, I have this video. I was probably uploaded on YouTube, I suppose. And then we see a video of Jack from Jupiter in one of his sex sessions, and he says his special word, which triggers his invulnerability. And apparently his special word is carpo. So when he says carpo, he goes invulnerable. And then all the trannies go to town on him. So that's what he likes to do. So Frenchie says, if the moment ever comes to take Jack down, be sure to remove his head before the second syllable of carpo. Butcher still isn't convinced of Jack's guilt though, and he says, I can't get it out of my head like we're being taken for a ride here. Hughie heads back to his apartment, and Annie is out shopping for shoes. So Hughie decides to look through Queen Maeve's file he stole from Doc Peculiar's, and he sees photos of the legend banging Queen Maeve. So then he reads the transcript between Legend and Maeve, and we learn a little bit about Legend and Maeve's relationship. And we also see the way a Legend uses some vernacular. It's kind of ridiculous. He refers to himself as daddy, and he calls Queen Maeve his little girl, as well as sugar pussy and other ridiculous names. Anyway, through this transcript, we get some confirmation about Maeve going to Doc Peculiar and getting Stormfront's baby aborted, as well as a little bit more discussion about those racy, naked photos of her that were shared around Von American's office. Issue 58, The Big Ride, Part 3 of 4. So Hughie and Butcher are back at Doc Peculiar's, and they are interviewing the transvestites that were with Jack that night. So we have, in the room, we have Doc Peculiar, and we have Tabitha, and she is the one with black hair and a black shirt. We have Jenna, she's the one with black hair and a yellow shirt. And we have Madeline, and she's the blonde one. And then there was Anastasia, and she is the one that was killed. So Butcher recaps. Jack showed up at 8. He wanted only 3 of you instead of 4. So Anastasia goes home at about 8:30, and then Jack leaves at 1 in the morning. Why was Anastasia the one to go? Was there anything between the two of them? And then Madeline thinks that Jack was kind of sweet on her, for a while anyway. But Tabitha, she thinks that's bullshit, and she doesn't understand where that's coming from. She thinks that Madeline is lying. She doesn't recall Jack showing the slightest affection for any of them. So Butcher and Hughie also suspect that maybe they are being played because everything is pointing conveniently to Jack. Too conveniently. So Doc Peculiar questions Madeline for a bit himself, and eventually he finds that Madeline has been using drugs, judging from the needle wounds on her arm. And then Butcher comments, "Oh, this is bad news for you young mads. Hughie, Doc Peculiar don't like his boys using. That said, I bet you've got a nice big syringe full of smack around here somewhere, ain't you, Doc? Go and get it for us, will you? Because I'm going to bang it into his arm over here, and we're going to see what's what." And Tabitha says, "You're not cops." And then Butcher replies, "Of course we are, sunshine. You talked to us, didn't you?" So later on that night, Hughie is back home, and Annie is sleeping, so Hughie decides to pour through more of those stolen files on Queen Maeve, and we read a transcript of a conversation between Stormfront and Maeve. Stormfront thought he was having a son, but Maeve instead gave birth to a black baby instead, which is obviously not Stormfront's. And the father to this child was apparently some other hero named Midnight Lightning. Now we see an image of this child back on the cover of issue 57. Now there's another thread between Homelander talking to Black Noir, and Homelander, he wants to set up Queen Maeve to have sex with Black Noir, and Maeve was blindfolded, and the Homelander and Black Noir are the same build, so she wouldn't find out until afterwards, much to her outrage and disgust. And Homelander sent the pics to everyone at Vought, and then we see the transcript of Maeve arguing with Homelander once she found out that Homelander sort of tricked her. So Maeve is like swearing at Homelander, and Homelander's like, "Calm down." So Maeve says, "Calm down my ass, I'll kill you, the both of you. You and his brain dead ape of yours. Don't you laugh at me." And then Homelander says, "You'll let us know when you're finished, won't you?" And then Maeve says, "I trusted you. I must have been out of my mind. You made me a laughingstock for the last time. You made me into a goddamn porno exhibition for the people at Vought, and now you make me have sex with this zombie? And then Homelander says, nobody made. And then Queen Maeve interrupts, what kind of sick, evil thing goes through that head of yours? And then Homelander says, you really want to know? And Maeve's like, yeah, I want to know. And then Homelander explains his thought process. He says, I thought enough time's gone by that I bet I can convince her I'm truly sorry. The stupid whore's in love with me anyway. She wants to think it was the bad things I did when I was immature, but I'm a better person now. And then I'll get her to do something really messed up. The end. That's what I was thinking. And then Queen Maeve's like, this isn't happening. This can't. And then Homelander cuts in, let's get Maeve to have sex with Black Noir. That'll be good for a laugh. And then Maeve is like, you overgrown frat boy piece of shit. And then Homelander says, bitch. And then Homelander says, don't overstep. And then we assume he's like choking Queen Maeve here. And then Maeve says, I'm sorry, please, you're hurting me. And then Homelander says, you ever lay a hand on me again, I will end you. Do you understand? Now, this is kind of an important transcript to read because it really establishes why Queen Maeve hates Homelander so much and why it drove her to help the boys and plant the bugs in the Seven's headquarters. Meanwhile, Butcher went to visit the Legend. Butcher tells the Legend that it wasn't Jack from Jupiter, it was a load of shit. Madeline admitted that she was paid $10,000 to lie. Now, Legend and Butcher can't figure out who would frame Jack from Jupiter, though. Who beats a tranny to death to frame Jack? Who knows the boys will be sniffing around and would plant a story that the boys would be dying to hear? And who knows about Doc Peculiar in the first place? And who wants the boys on a collision course with the Seven, which is the obvious place for it to go? Now, Butcher says he's not going to release the footage of Jack. Not that he's gonna phone the bastard and tell him that he's in the clear or anything. Then Butcher changes the subject and asks the Legend why Queen Maeve got rid of the bugs. And then the Legend says, she got scared. And then Butcher says, well, she better put them back or I'm gonna ring Vought and tell them what she's been up to. Now the Legend is protective of Queen Maeve. Butcher says she puts the bugs back in or I meet her in person. Un-effing negotiable. Now, jumping back over to Hughie with Annie, Annie is weighing herself and then herself with Jamie the hamster, and Annie is shocked to find that Jamie weighs a whole pound. He's just gotten really fat. And Annie is kind of trying to seduce Hughie by being all naked and the like. But just then, Hughie gets a text from Butcher saying that the Jack from Jupiter footage has been released. And now Butcher didn't do it, so someone released that footage. And Hughie needs to get back to the boys' HQ immediately. So back at the 7 HQ, Jack is freaking out because this footage leaked and is now all over the media and everybody is talking about it, so it's not good for him. And then Homelander tells Jack he's done. You can't possibly survive something like this. Superheroes don't do those things. It is in does not compute territory for the little people. You're off message is what you are. But I'll be ready to Photoshop you out of the picture. And then Jack says, well, I may be screwed, but I'm not getting screwed alone. I'll take the boys down with me. And then Homelander says, wrong again. And then Maeve chimes in, you might want to remember Lamplighter, right? And then Jack then says to Homelander, so what's going to happen to me now? Am I going to be exiled? Then Jack from Jupiter then throws around the N-word, and then the Deep, who's black, takes offense and tells Jack to watch his mouth. And then Jack says, oh, better by the minute. Now I'm taking shit from the least black man on the planet. And then the Deep smacks Jack, and Jack gets injured a bit because he didn't say his special word at the time. So Jack says his special word. He says Carpo, and he's now invulnerable. And then he says, you want to try it now? Want to give it another try now? And then Homelander steps in between the two of them. And then he says, do you want me to? Cut the shit, both of you. The last thing we need right now is a bad situation getting worse. And then Jack says, oh no, we wouldn't want anything messing with your little pet project, would we? And then Homelander says, a child of 4 would know to shut up at this point. And then Jack says, okay, man, I get it. Look, the last thing I want to do is piss you off, Homelander, but I didn't do this, okay? I swear it. Now you can listen to my heartbeat if you want, but I think you're gonna know I'm telling the truth. Have you thought about what's really happening here? The boys are doing this to me. They're doing this to you, Homelander, to the 7. They just decided, okay, he's guilty. Let's mess with him. And one upload later, they've taken down one of the top soups alive. Is that really how easy it is to do one of us? Are you really going to let that stand, Homelander? I mean, how much shit are you ready to eat for these dudes? Back at the boys HQ, Butcher claims he didn't upload the video, but the 7 are sure gonna think they did, so it doesn't really matter. The 7 are going to be gunning for them. So the boys get ready. Butcher tells Terror to stay behind in the office because he doesn't want anything to happen to Terror. And the boys head in the elevator and ride to the top floor and then head to the roof of the building. And there, waiting for them, is the 7. The 7 arrive, and then Homelander says, "So it's now good? Or should we have come back another time?" And then all the members of the 7 are there to greet the boys, and they're going to parlay. Issue 59, The Big Ride, Part 4 of 4. Butcher explains to Homelander that he didn't post the footage, and Homelander, listening to Butcher's heartbeat, believes him and says he's telling the truth. And Jack from Jupiter's pissed. He says, no, that's bullshit. It has to be them. I mean, who else could it be? And Homelander says, "No idea, but I know he's not lying." And then Jack says, "Butcher's controlling his breath or heartbeat or something." And then Homelander says, "Don't be ridiculous." And then Jack gets angry. He's like, "F that. I'm not going out like some asshole. I want payback for this shit. I'm going to kill these freaks and nobody's going to stop me." And then Homelander cuts in and says, "No, you're leaving. The stakes are too high for self-indulgence." Jack throws a hissy fit and he flies off cursing everybody out. And then Homelander goes to head out and says, "And we're going to leave as well because," and then Butcher cuts in, "because this ain't the time." And then Homelander says, "No, you're right, it isn't." And then the Deep says, wait. Someone has tried to provoke a war between us, a potentially cataclysmic confrontation. Should we not investigate? Should we not team up? And then Butcher interrupts, "No, you lot be on your way. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other sooner or later. Let's just get back to normal for now. Get everything back to normal, yeah?" And then the 7 go to head off. But before they do, Hughie is staring daggers at A-Train though. And then A-Train says to Hughie, because A-Train accidentally sort of caused Hughie's girlfriend's death ages ago. A-Train says to Hughie, "What's your problem?" And then Frenchie holds Hughie back from potentially fighting with A-Train. So the 7 finally take off. So the boys decide to sort of maybe celebrate their near brush with death by going for sticks, courtesy of Kessler's CIA expense account. So while at dinner, Butcher says that Jack, he found out some info that Jack ended up heading back to Doc Peculiar's, but none of the trannies wanted to go with him, so he's just doing tons of blow over there right now. And then Hughie says, "So are we going to try to find out who set us up here?" And then Butcher says, "Of course we are." And Hughie continues, "Because I mean, we all could have got killed there, like. That was definitely the objective. It's dastardly is what it was." And then Butcher says, "It's downright muttly, mate." And then Hughie then feels that Butcher stepped on one of Hughie's favorite words, dastardly. And Hughie gets mad. Angrily, he says that Butcher is always undermining him and throwing him off balance. Hughie's being a little bit sensitive here, but Hughie's definitely very skeptical of Butcher and Butcher's motivations. But Frenchie and Mother's Milk think that Hughie's just overreacting a bit. But Hughie says, "All of you, stop laughing at me." And Hughie says, "I've been here long enough to deserve some respect." And another thing, he hates how Butcher uses the derogatory language all the time. And when they were talking to the trannies, he was calling them him and mate and lady boys. That's not what they're called. And he says, I hate that shit, Butcher." Hughie says he hates the lack of respect. The same as when they investigated the murder of that gay man who was killed by Swingwing back in Volume 2. And then Butcher then reveals that he killed Swingwing by sabotaging his jetpack and removing the screw from it so it would run out of fuel. And Hughie says, "This is exactly the problem. I'm never being told exactly what's going on." So Butcher says that he'll try to stop undermining Hughie. And then later on, they return to headquarters. But when they get back to headquarters, this is so sad, guys. Terror has been killed. The dog Terror. They assume Jack from Jupiter did it in anger. Butcher excuses himself, and he says, I gotta see a man about a dog. And then Hughie says, you mean, wait a minute, you can't go after him, they're the 7. Mother's Milk holds Hughie back and tells him to shut up. He says, you're out of your goddamn mind? So we then go to Jess Bradley, and she's talking with Stillwell, and Jess Bradley was the one who tried to force the confrontation between the boys and the 7 and tried to set them both up so they would fight each other and finally they would wipe out the boys. But her plan failed in the end, and she offers to resign to Stillwell, but Stillwell says that he wants her to stay on. She showed initiative and ambition. She ran that simulation, she looked at the numbers, and she acted. It was a good plan, well executed. Maybe just poorly timed a bit. No real harm was done because, let's face it, Jack from Jupiter is very replaceable. Stillwell does say, though, that she probably shouldn't have released the footage, though, when Butcher wasn't going to do it. At that point, it's probably just best to cut your losses, but in the end, he still calls her vital to the Vought American team, and he ends the call with her. Now we jump back over to Butcher, and he shows up to Doc Peculiar's to kill Jack from Jupiter. He grabs Jack's throat before Jack can say Carpo and turn invulnerable, and then Butcher asks Jack, why did you kill my dog, Jack? Why did you do it? And then he stabs Jack multiple times. Jumping back over to Frenchie, Hughie, and Mother's Milk, they are drinking some whiskey and trying to put this bad day behind them. And then the female is lying beside Terror on the floor. Cut back to Jack from Jupiter and Butcher. And then Butcher is continuing to ask, why did you kill my dog, Jack? Why did you kill my dog? And he's stabbing him over and over and over again. And that is how the volume ends. So I thought this was a pretty good volume. We had lots of character deaths. So we had the death of Greg Mallory, the death of Jack from Jupiter, and the death that hit the hardest, the death of Terror the dog, which was really sad. It's so sad because Butcher loved that dog so much. And Butcher's such an asshole most of the time, but that dog was one of the few sort of things he was sentimental about and really deeply cared about. So seeing that dog get killed, you're heartbroken a little bit for sure. And I love Butcher's reaction to that. He just sort of freezes, and then he's like, excuse me, boys, I gotta see a man about a dog. And then he heads off. That was good. That was good. Yeah, so really interesting volume. I love learning more about Greg Mallory and all that history. We had all these holes in the boys' history that we sort of wanted to know about, and now we sort of do. So that was great. I thought the Jack from Jupiter storyline was pretty intriguing, and that escalation of a potential conflict between both groups was really exciting. So I'm very high on this volume. I thought it was really good, and I'm very excited to go through the remaining volumes now. Next volume is a miniseries all about Butcher's history, which is one of the few characters we still have a little bit we don't know about. So I'm excited to dive into that. But yeah, this was a great volume. I'm going to give this one an 8.5 out of 10. So thank you all for watching, and I will get back to you all with volume 10 as soon as I can.